Hello everybody, welcome back to the Shadow Sessions episode of this week's, let's start again. Yeah, that was rubbish, wasn't it, Daisy? I agree. Hi guys, welcome back. We're on the Shadow Sessions for this cycle under the Norse goddess Hel, and today we're talking about the Death Mother, and we're talking about it from a psychological perspective and something I came across just before we began the cycle itself. It's a really interesting topic, and it's going to be way bigger of a topic and an ongoing topic for me than is going to be fitting in one video, but we're going to do our best to explain to you guys what I mean when I say the Death Mother, how I came across it, and the massive revelation it was for me. So firstly, there are two books that I have on hand. I have other books, and I think I've got a couple on Kindle about this subject, so that I really want to recommend. And you may have seen this before, depending on which, I have mentioned this first one before, which is Belonging, Remembering Ourselves Home, Tokopaka Turner, sorry. Absolutely incredible book. I'm going to read the definition of what she talks about, and I also have Into the Heart of the Feminine, Facing the Death Mother Archetype to Reclaim Love, Strength and Vitality by Miss Simila Harris and Bud Harris. So there we go. I'm working my way through these, but I'm going to read to you the definition on page number 34. I was going to put my snake voice on, and I coughed. It was not good. I'm leaving that in. So when I read this, it sent shivers down my spine. So when I first got this book, I was in the Goddess Temple shop in Glastonbury waiting for my friend who was having a reading at the time. So it's some time back now because lockdown again. And I had a reading, then she had a reading. So. And the woman in the shop had recommended this book or something, I said, and she said, "You're welcome," because I bought it. And she was like, "Oh, you're welcome to sit down and just have a read while you're waiting." And I was chills, like full body chills when I read this. So, if like me, you grew up feeling unseen, invalidated, or worse, with the unspoken communication that you were unwanted or wished dead, you may be the child of a woman possessed by the Death Mother. The Death Mother is a term for this energy or archetype that resents, abandons, and even destroys her own child. Death Mother was originally coined by Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz and later fleshed out by Daniela Stieff, Confronting the Death Mother. And later fleshed out by author, teacher, and Jungian analyst Marianne Woodman in her interview with Daniela Stieff, Confronting the Death Mother, which I do have. I have that. That's online. As the Death Mother's target, the child eventually develops the conviction that she is living in a dangerous world and her life is at risk. But long after leaving the family home, the child is haunted by the Death Mother, who campaigns against her from the inside out. Before you even think about attempting something new, engaging your creativity, using your voice, or stepping towards change, the Death Mother is there. She only needs to raise a single eyebrow for your whole body to turn to stone. She is the paralytic energy that dismisses your creativity and demands your silence. She feeds on your shame and powerlessness and is provoked by any show of emotional color. No longer able to withstand the pain of rejection, the child will often stop offering her creative spark. She hides away where it can't be criticized, believing, as she's been taught, that it's worthless. As Woodman puts it, her unique creative core is split off and buried in the hidden recesses of her unconscious psyche. Instead, the child of the Death Mother does what he can to survive. He begins to perform the role he thinks will integrate him with his mother, attempting to behave in a way that might solidify his tenuous place and belonging, whether this manifests in perfectionism to reach mother's impossible standards, becoming fiercely independent of her, or becoming her champion and caretaker, even surrogate husband. The child attempts to be valuable in any way that he can to weather this hostile environment. But no matter how we attempt to outsmart her, we inevitably internalize the deaf mother. We begin conflating her voice with our own. Operating internally, the deaf mother is devastating to a person's life. As the child gets older, she will project this being not wanted onto others, anticipating rejection from friends, authority figures, even life itself. Worst of all, the child will turn that stone cold glare on herself. And she talks here about how finding out about the death mother archetype was revolutionary, and revelationary and revolutionary. So the reason that I really wanted to bring this up is initially I was hesitant about this because the archetype is called the Death Mother, and obviously we're talking about death goddess energy, and there is obviously a separation there. That is not one and the same thing. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that Hel then embodies the Death Mother, who is cold and uncaring towards children, because that's not the case. What I'm suggesting is that actually Hel resides and embodies the idea of what it means to be given or a child of the Death Mother archetype. As far as we know, Angrboda was not particularly invested in her 3 children. Her 3 children were taken away, and whether or not that was she wasn't bothered, we don't really know. Whether it's because, I don't feel like it would be something that would have bothered Angrboda, because it's said that Angrboda gave birth to wolves as well. So having another wolf, Fenrir, and some monsters, the monster Jörmungandr and Hel, I don't think it would have bothered her. And part of me feels like it's not actually Angrboda, her physical mother, who is the person who rejected her, is the Asgardians. That the complete and utter feelings of rejection in the Hel myth come from being so different, so starkly different to the rest of the Asgardians. And to me, it feels a bit like the myth surrounding Balder may have continued to exist because it highlights some of this. Balder was the chosen, the wanted, the light. Everybody loves him, everybody adores him, everybody worships him, and Loki does not. And perhaps there's an element of Loki seeing how his children were so rejected, and Balder is so esteemed, and there being a little bit of something going on fatherly there, as well as the fact that they wanted to upset the natural balance by bringing him back from the dead. By that point, Hel already had her own realm, and depending on where you read, she'd either been cast out because she was so different, or she knew and felt in her bones that she was so rejected that she asked to be removed and went and was given Helheim. And there's a more palatable relationship there with Odin, is suggested by some. It wasn't so much that he outright rejected her, but rather that she felt rejected by and like a misplaced child, and created her own realm. Within this, it talks about how often children of the Death Mother can become quite introverted, and they create their own safe world away from the dangers and the constant threats of the world that they see around them. And that would fit interestingly into Hel's myth of creating Helheim, of having her own realm where all are welcome, where the broken, the rejected are taken in. And interestingly enough, that through line of rejection and Death Mother energy feeds into the afterlife story, so that if those souls that are deemed worthy, those that are honorable, or by another word, wanted by Odin and Freya, are taken to their respective halls. The rest are left with Hel, and depending on the life that they led, are said to lead a good afterlife or not, depending on how they came there. If they came there by sickness or death, or young children born in childbirth, it's said that their afterlife was nothing to be sniffed at, whereas the adulterers and oath breakers didn't have such a good time of it. But to me, it's interesting that she takes all. She's a bit like Statue of Liberty in that way. What Statue of Liberty is meant to be. Give me your poor and broken and hungry. And she sort of surrounds them and takes them in at the point of death. And it feels to me more than just neutrality, because death would then be neutral, right? Death comes for us all. That is the balance, and that would be neutral. But given that there's an element of justice and judgment that happens in her realm, it makes me feel that she said, I will take all souls, regardless of whether others reject them. And what they find in the afterlife will be based on their own merits. It will be fair, and how they've come to the death will, in the grand scheme of things, which is how the Vikings believed it to be anyway, determine their afterlife, which fits with being super honorable and then getting to go to Valhalla is said to be a direct correlation from life through to death. So she maintains that as part of the natural balance of life and death. It feels like if you led a horrible life and you're an oath breaker, then you're going to find not so great things on the other side. Although how much of that is Christian influence is a good question, like we've mentioned in the podcasts, but that's not what we want to talk about here. We want to talk about this shadow of rejection, this shadow of the Death Mother. It's really fascinating, because you can find yourself having, and there are boxes to tick, by the way. If you have, I will read that from in here to see whether or not you have a Death Mother versus, what do they call it in this book? There's a Death Mother complex versus there's something else which is like a lesser version. The negative mother complex, and Death Mother is separate. So the Death Mother complex, when you have had, and I think this is applied to the feminine because of extra elements such as at the basic level, the Death Mother complex reflects the wounds to the feminine in our culture. It reflects devaluing for the elemental feminine, that is the ability to hold, nurture, comfort, nourish, and value our emotional and physical lives, as well as those of our children and other people. The Death Mother complex also reflects our devaluing of the transforming aspects of the feminine, which includes our ability to be patient, to be receptive to potentials, to bring forth new life in many forms, and to sustain the relationships these activities require. So this book puts it in perspective of what are conceived to be more masculine traits being encouraged, like the aggressive, top dog, business-minded aggression is seen as higher status, and it goes through that in more depth. But so the Death Mother will be distant, cold, doesn't know their child, isn't interested in them, considers herself a victim, doesn't have a heart for the child, thinks life is all about herself, is not appreciative, is constantly judging, is opinionated, is full of negativity, is cruel, is abusive, kills hope, kills initiative, kills creativity, drains our energy, and wounds body, mind, and spirit. So those are all some of the attributes given to what identifying the Death Mother complex in a mother figure. And unfortunately, I know all about this. This is exactly my experience as a child, and it explains an awful lot about my anxieties now. So I wanted to bring this up in a shadow working, because it is quite real for me. It's a part of my shadow work, and learning to love yourself when you have been so confronted with the fact that you are unlovable, and thinking that you are completely unlovable is a major indicator that you had a Death Mother in your life. And there is, by the way, there is separate information about fathers and how that impacts people as well. But it's just because of the wounding to the feminine in our society and how that plays a role in it that this came about. And that's interesting to me because of the role of death as a mother and the idea of self-love and not loving oneself. So why was Hel considered to be unlovable? She was humanoid. It was just that she had this skeletal half. And so what does that reflect? Well, she takes care of the dead, but so too do Odin and Freya in their respective halls. And neither of them are, feared in the same way Hel is, or pushed aside by the other Asgardians in the same way that Hel is. Hel's natural dominion is over death, but only certain types. And it's a very intriguing part of the Norse mythology, because many death gods, many underworld gods are treated with thinly veiled hostility by humans, because humans don't understand death and can't, and don't know how to control death because they can't, and don't know when death is coming for them, and they don't like the uncertainty, and the lack of control over it causes fear, and fear of the unknown feeds into fear and abhorrence towards the gods of death. And I've been thinking about this a little bit with regards to Hades as well, in recent days, because Hades is a pain in the backside. I love him really. I sort of adore him, but I have to treat him very carefully as well, because I think he wants to take over as like the main god of Morrigan. Just will not have it. He's been trying it for a while, and so, but I am very interested in how his portrayals in modern context, modern mythology, modern retellings of the stories. So recently, there've been a number of different. There's been loads and loads, and there always is loads and loads of Greek myths retelling and reworking the story. And Son of Zeus was the anime that was a unexpected hit on Netflix, which was fabulous, by the way. It's a fabulous anime or animated series. And they had a very limited amount of Hades. It's like Hades is going to be the antagonist, the bad guy, season 2. Everybody probably knows about the Disney one, which, whilst he's sassy, it's just not Hades to me. Like, not who Hades really is. I love the character, but it's not really who Hades is. And then, of course, we have Laura Olympus, which is much closer to Sexy Blue Daddy, in my mind. But it is interesting. Side note completely, but it is interesting on the different ways that actually, it's a good point. So it is very interesting. There's a multitude of ways in which this god is presented, but he is masculine. And it's interesting to me that feminine death gods don't get half as much attention in mass media. Now, arguably, the Greek gods get the most, with Egyptians probably on the second, representation in media. Why is this? Well, the Greek pantheon is based on very patriarchal myths. Is there something in that? Why is that? Like, why are these myths more at the fore than any others? And it's weird to me, because like the Celtic myths should be more at the fore in Britain than they are, but they're not. What is at the fore of like English storytelling is often King Arthur, which is sort of the Christo version of a lot of the Celtic myths. It takes the power away from the feminine, though, and goddesses are then removed, given a Christo slant. Arthur is entrenched. King Arthur Excalibur is entrenched in our consciousness, and so is to a degree like Robin Hood. That's from Nottingham, where I'm from originally, and that's male-led stories. But when it comes to strong feminine archetypes, the stories are like waylaid a little bit, and it's a little bit telling about some of the hidden patriarchy maybe in society, and that gives the wounds to the feminine because they're not represented in the same way. Morrigan gets represented like a demon, which I hate, and Hell is the only recent portrayal of Hell is obviously the Thor movie, where again she's the villain. Like, and it's sad because Loki at least has some nuance in those movies. Hellier does not. It's an interesting retelling of her myth, and Cate Blanchett is fierce, but in terms of how close it is to the story of Hell from the myth, or Hell as a goddess energy, not really. And instead there is this interest, actually it's an interesting point, because in that retelling of the myth, even though it's a comic book movie, it's not supposed to be a retelling, it's supposed to be very loosely based. But it is about a woman who was too powerful, who was denied her birthright and imprisoned. And her brothers were imprisoned. And to some extent, perhaps so she was she. It depends on which sort of interpretation of the myth we're taking. So was it that she was too powerful, and her rejection was because of her power came from a very different place. Her physique was very different. Her body was very different. It resembled the power within, and because she was, you know, part Jotun, because she was not Asgardian completely, and because her father was chaos, her power was incredible, ferocious, creative, and ignored and rejected. So let's go through the how the ideal, the list of what makes a death mother can be applied to the Hell myths and why. Distant and cold. So firstly, her actual mother would have been distant because she doesn't appear to be a part of the myths that we know of. And Hel herself is distant, but she's also, because she gets put out of the way, but she also gets put in Helheim, Niflheim, the realm of Niflheim in Helheim, which is winter and ice and cold. So you have the physical version of this distant cold energy. Does not know me. Hel's name is meant to be hidden, much like Hades is. And so this cold distance and not being known, and even her myth has kind of trickled away a little bit. 3 indicators that there is death mother lessons going on around her. Her mother is not interested in her, and her mother considers herself a victim. These do not apply so easily. The other Asgardians were not as interested in her. They kind of like rejected her a little bit. I wouldn't say that there was any victimhood element within, obviously within, and definitely not within Angrboda. She's full-blown warrior. But there is an interesting element of victim being applied to the role of women, and that she kind of victim is victimized by others, is created to be a victim. And the interesting thing there is that maybe applies to her brothers a little bit more, that the Asgardians consider themselves to be victims of these children eventually. They know that Ragnarok will be caused by these children, and they, in that situation, consider themselves to be victims, not being held to account. So there is an interesting thing there. It doesn't have a heart for me. There wasn't much love shown to Hel, and if it is true that she was in love with Balder, maybe he's in love with her. I don't know. Are they together in the afterlife? Who can say? He had a special place of honor. He had a throne. Maybe it was just opposites attract there. Who knows? But she didn't feel loved by any of those who, were around her. thinks life is all about her. Now, this can apply to Frigga in the situation where she thought life should revolve around her in so much as that she tried to stop Balder's death. So it's a twist on what that is. But there you go. It's not appreciative, it's constantly judging. Is opinionated, is full of negativity. So I don't feel that Hel was given much appreciation. She was definitely judged. They definitely had opinions over what was about to happen as her role as a death goddess. And from what you can tell, they must have felt quite negative towards her. I very much doubt that she was making up that she felt uncomfortable there. Were they cruel and abusive? It feels more passive aggressive than we saw. The idea of killing initiative, creativity, though, feeds back to the idea that the Asgardians had a very set way of doing things. They tried to pervert what happened to Balder. They don't want the end of their reign. They want to remain in charge. They don't want the Asgardian cycle to end. They don't want Ragnarok to occur. And the draining of our energy, wounding body, mind, and spirit can be embodied in death itself. So the eventual draining away of energy is actually embodied by death, as is the wounding of the mind, body, and spirit. So it kind of shifts over a little bit within the Hel myth, but it definitely exists. And it just makes me think of some of those shadows of isolation and rejection, and how they have cause real problems for so many of us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here at the end, moving away from the examples directly tied to the books and tied to Hel. So we did a little bit of a ritual already about this, and I kind of wanted to do the ritual first to kind of open the space to healing, instead of starting with the shadow work video itself. So you can go back to that video as much as you like for the ritual and redo it if you so wish. But for me, the ideas of rejection and isolation are actually really scary concepts, because it can feel like floating on an iceberg out at sea all alone. You feel very cold, you feel under threat, you feel like you're dying, you can't breathe, and it fits with that cold, icy energy really interestingly. And isolation and rejection do really strange things to people. They're things that people try and avoid quite a lot of the time. Most human beings are social creatures, even if that social is for introverted people, with a very few people and in limited doses. But generally speaking, nearly all humans enjoy other humans' company on some level, in varying degrees. And then rejection is really, really hard, because depending on what it is, it can just feel soul crushing. It can make you feel unlovable. It can make you feel like there's something terribly, terribly wrong with you. And I think there's a lot in this modern society which feeds the essence of rejection in such a foul way. And it really does it towards women. I mean, I really feel the hand of patriarchy on this one, guys. I'm getting on my rant box, but have you ever considered the difference between how men are taught their worth in terms of relationships versus women, and how they're taught to handle rejection, or how rejection looks in society? You only have to look at some of those memes with the women trying to be, say they're not interested in a guy, knowing that they're going to get hostility. And there's truth in the idea that, like, the worst the man expects is a bruised ego, and women are fearing death. They're fearing being raped and murdered if they reject somebody. There is a really horrible underlining truth there in how the rejection plays out for different people. Like embarrassment versus death, it's a whole world apart. And you know, there are many case studies that you can read, some on social media even, like of women expressing of the times that they didn't, like some women that just didn't even respond to a guy in time, and he just flips. He just turns the switch from nice guy to incel insane in moments, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And so in that circumstance, whilst, you know, some men are just dicks, and some women are too, let's, you know, we're not saying that one side is saintly and one side is sinners. That's not what we're saying. But I do feel that there is a a way in which like something has failed based on how we teach people their worth along the road. And there is examples in some of the Death Mother books. One of them saying that they would felt more rejected because they were daughters, and they were expected to work to support the family so the sons could become doctors, even though the women were just as smart. And there was some interesting stories in these books themselves. And so there is definitely a weird interplay within the shadow there. Now, that's in hetero couple situations, and it's interesting when you start changing the dynamic, because I noticed recently there are posts going around from gay guys saying like you'll be surprised how quickly straight men understand consent if it's a gay guy coming onto them, and that dynamic. It's just that they feel they can lord power over women and kind of pressure them, and so there's that really strange undertones of some of that rejection energy in the world right now. And it's playing out on a grand scale because right now we're seeing en masse what happens when men are rejected in America. Political situations, certain types of incel. Yeah. But you know, rejection it's very hurtful. And what happens in these situations is it's taken to such a weird extreme that we see it play out in a kind of very vicious way. And they kind of feed off each other, don't they? Rejection and isolation. Because the more rejected you feel, the more isolated you feel. The more rejected you feel, the more you might self-isolate yourself away. And that leads to a nasty spiral between the two. Then you feel more rejected by life, society, and people because you have, you know, hermited off. And it can be a very difficult cycle to break out of, and requires a whole lot of healing. There is no one simple way to healing these wounds at all, which is why I have several books about the Death Mother, and working on that journey towards healing and self-love. But I did want to share it here. I did want to talk about it and draw your attention to it and just kind of explain it to you guys as I know it so far. I'm not saying I'm an expert or anything. I'm not. But I do find it fascinating, and I did want to bring it to your guys' attention. So now Glowy Joey, because the lights here are weird because we're getting into winter now, is gonna call it for the day. So many blessings, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Have a very wonderful day and stay strong.